very pleased to introduce Nick. I'm sure I know some of you know him quite well, but Nick is back in the Trust after a short sojourn away as our learning technologies lead. But he has a very interesting skill set that we discovered, and that's what we wanted to explore with him tonight. So there's a particular project that Nick's working on related to Dartmoor that I want to spend quite a bit of time on this evening because it's fascinating, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. But just to lead into that, so Nick, I just want to take you back to 2012 when we needed a technician to come and look after our simulation lab, and asked Electrosonic, the company that we had the contract with, to find somebody, and you turned up and started the post, and then a few months later came to me and said, I think we could do this better. We could use filmic theory to overcome the plastic skin syndrome. What do you think? And all I heard was, we can do this better. And then a few months later, you had a GoPros strapped to your head with duct tape. So we've got some photographs which may help you explain that. But can you just explain to the other people, as you did to me then, how you were able to come up with this? Because it was an interesting conversation.
Sure. So I think it was, so my experience and what I'd studied at university and then practiced sort of 10 years before coming to the Trust was actually filmmaking. So my real passion is documentary filmmaking. And my best friend's dad was a lighting cameraman for what was then West Country Television, which you might remember. West Country was the local division of ITV. And I would make lots of films growing up. And then one day he said, do you want to come and do some work experience with me? This guy called Ray. And I was like, great. And I spent this week on set filming local news and things like that. And he was teaching me the camera, and I got really into understanding the camera in and out and such. And I always remember that. And I've just had this kind of love for cameras since then, really. And at university, I went and studied what was then the only documentary degree program. And that was run by a guy called John Pett. And John Pett's great. He's a director, and he directed a series called The World at War, which some of you may be aware of or know. And to me, that's one of the most landmark documentary series of all time. And I do have an interest in World War II anyway. But if you watch that series, they're some of the most aesthetically pleasing interviews setups you'll ever see. The lighting, the way the interview's conducted. And I learned a lot from John, and it wasn't the technical stuff. It was the way we get story and narrative out of somebody, how we understand someone's backstory, and how the camera kind of does subtle things to enhance that. So if you watch The World at War, you'll notice in interviews, the camera very slowly kind of moves in, and he very slowly approaches the person being interviewed. And I guess it was these kind of cinematic elements that I got really addicted to, and really wanted to understand how we can use the camera to understand kind of connectivity and emotion and things like that. So when after sort of 10 years of working kind of freelance and being a bit fed up of working up in London all the time, my family had a young family down here. There was opportunity came up at the Trust, and at the time I was looking at aviation simulation and other things out of interest, and sort of rocked up at the Trust and could see we were using cameras, but to me as a filmmaker, I didn't think we were using them right. You know, in our sim rooms we had cameras mounted to the ceiling, and that camera was a static image. It was a very distant image, and actually if you watched it back, it felt like CCTV, you know, it felt very authoritative, and it doesn't really tell much of a story. So very simply, in those early days, it was simply a case of, actually, I think there's a lot we can do with the camera to understand a little bit about narrative, backstory, and different perspectives in these scenarios. And so, I think it was a case of just repositioning the camera for a lot of these things, and looking at things like how we get close-ups and the things that sometimes go amiss in training. There'll be things like touch and the way people are responding to something, which actually tells a story in its own right. And actually, a lot of the time, not a technical kind of approach to stuff, but then what you'd call the non-technical, or I like to term like the humanistic skills, you know, of a performance, if you like. So that's basically what it was. It was like, okay, can we look at how we reframe using cameras, and can we tell a story a bit differently? So that's how it started. A filmmaker in the NHS, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Could you share some of the images, David, because I think they help tell the story. So we identified early on that we had cameras, but perhaps weren't using them to tell the story. But fairly rapidly, I remember you started to talk about 360, and so I don't know if there's
Yeah.
any of these images are particularly helpful, but to make the point. But tell us how you moved into the 360. But maybe explain what 360 is, because there may be some people that are
Yeah,
less
sure.
familiar with that.
So I spent a little while looking at, as you can see here, using a camera a bit differently, and just with some kind of sort of cinematic sort of influence, if you like. And so images like this are very powerful to me because they really focus on something that can otherwise go amiss. So this, to me, it really summarizes unison and teamwork, and there's a lot of emotion in it. And then the next image as well, and that was really great. But I and there's a great value, I think, to the still image like this or to the close up. But actually, if you look back at history and medical imagery, before it became a imagery was used for diagnosis, it was used to understand and to kind of enhance and heal. And actually, there's an image here of projected imagery, so big imagery, sort of pre-360, which was used to entertain and for well-being and such. And actually, if you could go to the next image, David, there's this wonderful example of American soldiers in a French hospital having films projected on a ceiling. And I just thought that was really magical, this idea of the big image, or the immersive image. And going further back in Roman times, so in these great villas, you'd have an escape room almost, where families would have an immersive room which would be painted beautifully as vineyards or these great outdoor spaces to escape the busyness of the streets of Rome, where they could go as a family and they could relax and spend time together. So this idea of immersive imagery isn't necessarily new, but I was really interested in actually what we miss outside the camera angle, outside the shot. So what we tend to see in kind of simulation practice is actually the conversation that happens in a corner of a room is the most important bit, because it's the point where you understand someone's actually worried about something, or there's a key bit of information being exchanged, or maybe it's simply that in that corner of a room, something's occurring, there's a bit of equipment, it could be anything, but we're missing that with these fixed shots. So I started looking at 360 and this idea of immersion, because when you go into a space, you don't just look straight ahead. You notice the duct tape that's keeping a chair together, or a light bulb that's blown, or whatever that might be. And for me, yeah, and there's an example in a minute with a light bulb that's blown. But for me, it's noticing those things that really enhance or bring a fidelity to the space.
Uh-huh.
And so I started playing with 360, and this was sort of 2013, 2014. So it was way before kind of consumer 360 cameras were available, and you'd end up with rigs like this, which were just a load of GoPros in a cradle system, and that was good. GoPros are great cameras, but it took a long time to stitch these images together, and it was, so for me, it was all about understanding outside the frame, if you like, and looking at how we use 360 in simulation. And actually what became the most important thing for me was understanding perspective and patient perspective. Something so simple that is forgotten, or had been forgotten in our training, and training everywhere, is we're practicing on this mannequin, we're doing, we're assessing, we're doing all these sorts of things, but actually, how does this environment look? How does it feel to the patient or the relative? And I don't think a patient will ever just sort of look straight in front. Yeah, the ceiling space is a big deal, but actually they will sort of try and look around and such. So it's about capturing everything about that. And so Todd's in the room, I think, but there you got Todd there, and Julian and Donahue, part of the sim team. And this was me playing the role of a patient rather than our mannequin in the end. And there's a lot you capture from a perspective. There's an awful lot. I mean, to me, this tells a huge story. I mean, I think this is quite frightening in many ways. And you've heard me mention this many times, Matt. And I remember when I started doing this work, it got quite a lot of traction with other trusts and stuff. So I ended up sort of doing a circuit and presenting the patient perspective, which, is, I can't believe it was such a novel concept, but there we go.
Well,
and everyone always mentions, oh, look, the light bulb's blown, and I said, well, look, it's not a big deal with the light bulb's blown. That light bulb's been blown in the sim lab for ages, but actually, to the patient, if the light bulb's blown, what else have they forgotten to do? They've forgotten to change the light bulb. And it's those sort of things that that are very, very important for a patient's journey. Those assurances that you need to have and such, and the fact that you've got a guy there with a mask on it staring at you. You see what I mean? There's a lot of emotion involved with this sort of imagery, and so that's kind of what I started looking at, was immersive filming, if you like, in the simulated environment and in healthcare.
So I suppose it's just worth highlighting that you were putting healthcare professionals into this experience, and although this is a static image, they can then look round that room and see into the corners and even see behind them by moving their head in the headset.
Yeah.
What was the sort of reaction you got from healthcare professionals when you put them into that patient perspective?
Yeah, it was quite powerful, actually. I mean, we talk about virtual reality as a technology. Some of you may be familiar with. It's in the news quite a bit now. But this was 2014, and at this point, VR really hadn't taken off again. And I managed to get a VR headset by going straight to the manufacturer, which would be impossible now, because emailing Facebook for a headset, they would probably go, no chance. But back then, it was, oh wow, you're using this in healthcare, great. So they sent me one of these very, very first early VR headsets, Oculus DK1 it was, and I put the 360 video in that. And what that allowed us to do for the first time was actually move our heads wearing something and actually looking around. It was quite a novel idea, you're actually moving the video around as you look around. I think the reaction we had was, this is extremely powerful. I hadn't perhaps considered this perspective before, or I've been practicing medicine for 10, 20 years. I thankfully not had to be a patient, but this teaches me a lot about communication and things like that. So, I had a few people come out with tears in their eyes, and I wasn't quite prepared for that, because, I basically just made this film thinking, oh, this is cool. I've got a pretty good hunch this could be quite useful, but the feedback sort of spurred me on to think, actually, this could be quite a seriously valuable project. And we made quite a few films in the end.
Well, I know that turned into quite a theme within your work in the education directorate, but just take us up to Dartmoor, and where does Dartmoor come into your life, and what does that mean to you?
Dartmoor is extremely important to me. I mean, I lived in Tavistock. I grew up in Merrytavy, which is a little village near Tavistock, and the house we had was right on the moors. And my dad and I would spend hours on the moors growing up. We would go for walks, and that was, to me, that was my connection with my dad. And when I think back to my childhood, it's walking on the moors, having a hot chocolate and some soup, whatever that might be. There's something kind of therapeutic about Dartmoor. I go up on Dartmoor and I just feel the burdens kind of lighten, and it's such a beautiful place. And I think I moved away for a while and went and worked in London, as you kind of do as a sort of cameraman, media person. And when I came back, I kind of promised myself that I would make more of Dartmoor again. Like, this is too important. So Dartmoor's a place I'll go as much as I can, and I just think it's the most beautiful place. And for me, it's about capturing that beauty, and how can I do this place justice? You see wonderful photography taken up there, but I always find it really hard to capture the things that are important to me. And that's the noises as well. It's the soundscape. It's the blades of grass moving, and, we go camping up on the moors, my father-in-law and I, and we'll just camp out there and we'll look at the stars and such. But the last few years, I've been recording Dartmoor in 360, almost documenting an immersive version of Dartmoor for the last sort of 4 or 5 years now. Hello. So, and the 360 cameras, I've had a few cameras in those sort of 5 years, and they've gone bigger to smaller and then bigger again, and this is one of the smaller cameras, which is a dual lens camera. So it has a lens on the front and the back, which you have to stitch. And they're 180-degree fisheye lenses. And when you put them together, you get a 360 sphere, which you can navigate around. But yeah, this is like a little profile picture of me up on the moor with a smaller camera. And then the cameras kind of get bigger. But yeah, capturing Dartmoor, Matt, is just really, for me, it's two things. It's one, I get to go up on Dartmoor and just feel good. And two, I hope I can capture Dartmoor for others that perhaps can't get up on the moors quite so easily, really.
So I think we've got some video of the Dartmoor, one of the tours, Hay Tour.
Yeah.
David, I don't know if you could go to that now.
Sure. Nick, can I ask you one or two questions from the chat before we go over to that, if
Yeah, of
that's
course.
okay?
Yeah.
So what have we got? So going back to the patient perspective, comment from Kat really about it gives you a fresh perspective to see things that otherwise are just part of the furniture and you don't really notice them.
Yeah, most definitely.
And from Di, isn't it sad that we miss the patient perspective and it seems so obvious but it's been overlooked? And then did you actually was there any point where you thought about being a cameraman on TV and films and
I was a cameraman in television for a while. So I worked as a freelance cameraman for the BBC and Channel 4. So you may catch a glimpse of me occasionally when the camera pans around on Songs of Praise. I worked on Channel 4 on a couple of comedy series as well and a few documentaries. So I did work in television a little bit, and I was fortunate enough to be involved in a couple of feature films as well as a third assistant cameraman. So if you work in feature films, there's this long line of hierarchy of camera people. So before you become a cameraman, there's an assistant to an assistant to an assistant. And so I worked as the third camera assistant or the third AC on a film called The Da Vinci Code, which is one that Ron Howard directed, and also Elizabeth the Golden Age, which is one with Kate Blanchett. She plays Queen Elizabeth, and it's a sequel. And I also was a cameraman and cinematographer on a couple of small, short films that did quite well on the film festival circuit. So,
cool. So there's a somebody asking you, Paul, asking you to talk about the 360 poetry you did, which I know you're coming on to. So should we look at some of the films? Which film do you want me to put up first of all?
You could just pop up Hator. So this is an example. So what I'm trying to do is capture as many tours as I can in 360 and then connect them all together. So you can do something called hotspots, which is basically when you're looking around a 360 video, you can then click somewhere in the video and it will jump to another video. And so my intention is to join all these 360 videos up so you can jump between all the tours and do your own little virtual walk around, if you like. But for the sake of this, I've just uploaded a couple of 360 videos to YouTube, and this is Hator, and you can spin the camera around. It's obviously struggling a little bit, I think.
That's fine. You did the music for this as well, didn't you?
Yes. The music isn't too impressive, but it's just making it a little bit more kind of chilled out, relaxing. And then I try and get a nature buzz track as well, and I enhance that. So you can view it sort of as you're doing, David, by spinning it around using your mouse, or you pop it into a VR headset and use your head to look around and anything like that, really. So this was a very pleasant summer's day, I think.
And the advantage of this is the video rather than a plane, because you can navigate around some of the flatter images. But in this one, as you navigate around, you'd see the grass moving, the people walking,
yeah,
the clouds moving, as if you were there.
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, there is some absolutely stunning photography and videos of Dartmoor, and I think an element was just trying to do something a bit different, something a bit novel, but actually go to Dartmoor and you're just surrounded with this incredible vista. You look around, you're on top of a tour, and you do a 360 kind of look around, don't you? You look right around, and I just wanted to try and capture that as well. Okay. Yeah, that's probably okay, actually, David.
David, I think we can answer one of the questions that's come out. If you could go back to just to bring it back, we'll come back to the poem. I want to finish on the poem. But David, if you could go back to the images, there's one that will. Let's get that up, because you've brought that into the hospital now, haven't you? And if you just go to the image of the young area, so this is a patient, and I think he's actually looking at that or similar experience, isn't he?
Yeah. He's looking at, I don't think he's looking at Haytor. I think he's got Saddle Tour there or Cox Tour or something like that. But he basically, I created a montage of 360 tours, which sort of plays around for like 15 minutes or so, and he's enjoying that. But one of the wonderful things about Tor Bay Hospital is through certain windows, you can actually see the tops of Haytor and such. And just thought it would be wonderful to bring the outside back in, and so there's a lot of work we're doing at the moment looking at the kind of the therapeutic use of virtual reality in healthcare, and actually how we can maybe look at using our local area like Dartmoor for part of that healing process. So that's what this chap's doing here, who broke his leg jumping out of a window.
And even in quite a high-tech environment, if you could just go to the picture before. So this was a patient that Todd will recognise, and this is a slightly different immersive experience, but even in the complicated ITU environment, you managed to take this Nick, the patient Nick, who was very happy for us to tell his story, out of that environment and into a different world using the computer down on the right there.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most magical moments I've ever been involved in, to be absolutely honest with you. I don't know if there was a dry eye in the house. It was quite incredible. You had this guy Nick who would cycle around, and we were able to put him in on a virtual tour of Wembury around routes that he was familiar with from outside, and being able to do rehab with a visual aid of something that you're quite passionate about, and hearing the ocean and the birds and having a route which is familiar. Really, as he said, this is magic. And when you hear that, you think, okay, what we're doing as technicians and what digital can do and what imagery can do for therapy and recovery works. It happens.
Absolutely.
And ever since this moment, I've absolutely just been, I'm 100% convinced that it has a massive part to play in healthcare.
I totally agree with that, and that's what you've educated us about in the education and the trust. So thank you. Before we finish on the poem, any final questions, David?
There's a question about the clarity and the fidelity, I suppose, really, in terms of do you think the images are going to be so clear that it is like real life? At the moment with the VR, there's still that dissonance between seeing it but knowing it's not the same as looking at the world.
Yeah, I think as the resolution of the technology improves, same with the cameras, then yes, there is going to definitely be an element of a question of realism. But there's this thing called the uncanny valley that exists in virtual reality and other things, where actually to pursue the idea of realism, we are unable to separate ourselves from that of what is reality and what is a set-up experience. And there's actually a familiarity and a comfort around being able to identify the difference. And so I don't ever necessarily push the idea of the high fidelity or the high, realism quality. I don't think that's the way we increase interaction and uptake. I think we just get the experiences right and curate them so that they work for somebody, they mean something for somebody. That's far more important. I love the coastline. If somebody says, look, this is a thing of the coastline, then that's going to have far more connection to me than perhaps saying, oh, this is a 16K resolution image, you can't tell the difference. That doesn't mean a lot to me, if you see what I mean. And I think it's just being sensitive to what's important to people, their stories, the environments which mean something to them as well.
I mean, I know with when I was more involved with simulation and teaching on a master's course there, that was one of the key things that I wanted to explore with people, really, because there is this fascination with fidelity, I think, isn't there, really? And in the same way that black and white photos can convey emotion in a way that color can't, true fidelity to real life isn't necessarily the end point, I guess.
No, and I think there's a reason why people are returning to analog film and photography, and why we see this resurgence of people buying old projectors and things. There's something about the imperfect image which is comforting. And in cinema, there's a lot of work at the moment about watching a film which isn't digitized, which has the flicker effect and has the imperfect coloring to it, because there's a warmth to it. There's something that we connect ourselves to. And I think that's the same with technology as well. There's a lot of work around that. And that's why I'm writing a PhD.
Okay. So, David, do we have time, do you think, to play the poem?
I think we need to make sure there's time. Yes, I'm sure we have got
Let's
time. Yeah.
move to that now. I appreciate there's some other questions coming in, but we'll come back to those maybe either offline or at the very end, because it would be good to show this.
In November, I lit a candle and left the flame to dance amongst the other voices of flickers that would eventually tire and burn out. But my footsteps already echo in this place, of high ceilings and stone floors, engraved with names and distant dates. The stone, the rock, the beginning. In November, as the landscape gave way to emptier views, the echoing sounds of the old church bell embraced me a while to linger, to turn and look, before walking the path, the start, the first steps. A rusted gate blocks the way, an unused trail that I'll have to revive. Under the orange and golds, the floor of leaves that highlight the autumn hold. Under my coat, wind blown, I whisper, it had to be now. In November, I leave the place from which stone and rock help build, and the comforts of a pub fire, a wooden bench, the chatter of the local tale, downed easy with the local ale, in search of the raw thought, the drip that I can hear at night. Drip, drip, the mind wanders. Drip. In November, the river runs full, the crystal flow from the moor. It carves the land in two, bettered only by granite stone, placed carefully by hands of old, now a historic mark. I walk in the footsteps of many that laboured before me. The river talks, but this is not the drip I hear. In November, the peaks look so blue, the sky white and lifeless, the rocks though still like anew. I stroll higher to find the point, not just as a distant landscape of thought, framed from a window from the village below, but I walked it and lived it. And as I climb, I wonder, if I get closer, can I hear? Will you speak? The tors offer a shelter, a figure in their shape, like rock giants we used to joke, holding pose as if just laid to rest. And our names for them I recite, all the while looking for that place, the flame and the drip when they meet. In November, like any other time, the view still, it is all of me. And in that final spot, I have walked this journey for us both, and wished the candle wouldn't go out. But the drip that douses it, at least another year, I know, I will.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nick. Inspirational as ever, and I can see you've inspired a couple of people in the this evening. So thanks very much, and we look forward to carrying on the journey with you. So
Thank you for having me.